My stepdaughter had me escorted out of my own husband's will reading. She was very polite about it. She even held the door. What Camille did not know, as she watched them walk me down that hallway, was that the company she was about to inherit had never belonged to her father. Let me start at the beginning. My name is Ruth Vance. I am 68 years old, and I have kept a set of books since I was 24. Not as a hobby, as a profession, and then as a habit, and finally as a kind of faith. Numbers do not lie to you. People do it constantly, and they do it best when they are certain you are not paying attention. I met Walter Vance in 1981 in a rented office above a hardware store, with a space heater that only worked if you kicked it. He had a contractor's license, a truck with a bad transmission, and absolutely no idea how much money he was losing every single month. I had a bookkeeping certificate and $41. We were not married then. We were not anything then. We were two people who signed a partnership agreement on a Tuesday because neither of us could afford a lawyer to tell us not to. 55% to me, 45% to him. Walter insisted on those numbers, not me. He said it plainly in that flat way he had. You're the one who knows where the money goes. If we ever disagree, I'd rather lose. We married 4 years later. We never once amended that agreement. Not when the company grew, not when we bought the yard on Fulton Street, not when Walter's first wife died and his daughter Camille came to live with us at 14 years old, furious at the world and, quite reasonably, at me. I did not try to be her mother. I made her lunch. I signed her school forms. I sat in the parking lot for 2 hours the night she got her heart broken and did not ask her a single question. For 30 years, I was the woman in the house who was not family, and I made a kind of peace with it. Walter died in March, his heart the way it had been threatening to for a decade. He went in his chair with the television on, which is precisely how he would have chosen it, and 11 days later, his daughter had me removed from the reading of his will. Camille had married a man named Dean Hollis, who sold commercial insurance and spoke about himself in the third person when he was nervous. Between them, they had spent about 15 years living slightly beyond a life they had not built. That was not what bothered me. People overspend. What bothered me was the winter Walter got sick, when Camille started calling twice a week, and every call arrived at the same destination by a slightly different road. How was Dad's paperwork? Had he updated anything? Did I understand that the company was, at the end of the day, his life's work? She meant his, not ours. She had grown up inside that word and had never once noticed it was load-bearing. I did not correct her. I have found that people who are busy underestimating you will hand you a great deal of useful information, entirely free of charge, provided you do not interrupt. So I said very little. And I called Nadia Reyes. Nadia had been our attorney for 22 years. She is the sort of person who reads the footnotes of the footnotes and remembers them 4 years later, at dinner, unprompted. I asked her one question. Nadia, is the 1981 agreement still good? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ruth, that agreement is the single cleanest document I have ever seen in my professional life. Nobody has touched it in 44 years. I said, good. Then let's not touch it now. The reading was set for a Thursday, in a conference room downtown with a long table and a view of a parking structure. I arrived early because I have always arrived early. Camille arrived with Dean and a lawyer of her own, a young man in a suit that fit him the way a suit fits a man who has just bought his first good one, and Camille looked at me and said, in a voice pitched for the room rather than for me, Ruth, I think it would be better if you waited outside. This is a family matter. The young lawyer looked at his shoes. Dean examined the ceiling. Nobody said a word. And I did something that surprised me. I stood up and I said, of course, because here is a thing I have learned in 68 years, and I would like you to take it with you whether or not you ever need it. When someone is building something against you, the kindest thing you can do, the strategically kindest thing, is get out of their way and let them finish it. If you have ever been told you are not really family by people who were perfectly happy to eat at your table, then you already know exactly what that hallway felt like. Do an old woman a favor. Subscribe to Aunt Justice and stay with me, because the next 15 minutes are the reason I am telling you this at all. I sat in that hallway for 50 minutes on a bench that was not designed for sitting. I want to tell you I was calm. Mostly I was tired. There is a particular exhaustion in being right about someone you had hoped to be wrong about. What I did not know, what I found out afterward, in a way I will get to, was what had been happening in the 8 weeks before Walter died. Camille had gone to a lender. Not a bank. A firm that specializes in what they call inheritance advances. They give you money now against what you are going to receive later, at a rate that would embarrass a casino. She had signed for $410,000. She used it to clear Dean's debts, to put down a deposit on a house in a neighborhood with a gate, and to pay off the young lawyer in the good suit, in advance, because she wanted him focused. And to get that money, she had to sign a sworn statement describing exactly what she expected to inherit. She had written in her own hand, majority ownership of Vance Contracting. She had never read the partnership agreement. Not once in 30 years. It had simply never occurred to her that there was anything in it to read. At 11:50, the conference room door opened and Nadia Reyes stepped into the hallway and said, "Ruth, would you come in, please? I want to be honest with you about this part because it would be easy to make it grander than it was." I did not sweep in. My knee hurt. I walked in slowly, and I sat down in the chair nearest the door, and I put my hands flat on the table the way I have done in every meeting of my adult life. Camille was smiling. It was the loosest I had seen her face in months. The young lawyer was stacking papers, and Nadia said, "Before we conclude, there is a governing document that has to be entered into the record. It predates the will by 4 years." She slid a photocopy down the table, 44 years old, typed on a machine, not a computer. 2 signatures at the bottom, one of them mine, in handwriting that was rounder then. "Walter Vance held a 45% interest in Vance Contracting," Nadia said. "That is the entirety of what his estate can convey. It is what he left to his daughter, and she now owns it, fully, without dispute." Camille said, "Right. So, the company." "No," Nadia said. 45% of it. There is a specific quality of silence that arrives when a person's arithmetic stops working. It is not loud. It is more like a room holding still. Dean said, "Who has the rest?" Nadia did not answer him. She looked at me, because it was not her sentence to say. And I said, "I do, 55, since 1981. Your father wrote those numbers himself, Camille. He wrote them because he trusted me with the money, and because he would rather have lost an argument than won a bad one. If you have ever been walked out of a room by people who were standing on ground you paid for, you already understand me. Subscribe and stay close, because this is where the paperwork she signed comes back for her." Camille's lawyer began to speak about challenging the agreement, and Nadia let him get most of the way through it before she said, quite gently, "Counsel, before you file anything, has your client told you about the advance?" He turned and looked at Camille, and her face told him. "Here is what an inheritance advance is, underneath the brochure. It is a loan secured against a sworn description of what you are going to get. If the description turns out to be false, you have not simply borrowed badly. You have made a material misrepresentation in writing to a lender for money you have already spent." Camille owned 45% of a private company. It pays a dividend. It is worth something real. It is not nothing. It was not $410,000. And it could not be sold to a stranger, because the 1981 agreement contains a clause I had entirely forgotten about. One that Walter had insisted on in the same conversation as the 55, requiring any transfer of shares to be offered first to the other partner, at book value. Me. She could not sell what she had borrowed against, not to anyone but me, and not for anything close to what she owed. The lender wrote to her in June, then their attorneys wrote in July. The gated house went back on the market before they had finished moving in. Dean's firm let him go in a way that was described as a restructuring. And in August, Camille came to my kitchen door. She did not apologize. I want to be accurate about that because I think the apology people imagine is usually more satisfying than the one that actually arrives. She stood on the step and said, "I didn't know." And I said, "No, you didn't read." I let her in. I made tea because that is what my hands do. I did not buy her shares. I will not. She is going to keep them and the dividend and the quarterly statement with my name at the top of it for as long as she lives. I did do one thing. I paid the lender directly, not the whole sum, but the portion that was compounding fastest. And I did it through Nadia, structured as a loan from me to Camille at 2%, documented properly, signed by both of us at the same table where Walter and I signed in 1981. She asked me why. I told her the truth. I told her that her father would have done it, and that I had spent 30 years being told I was not family by a girl whose school forms I signed, and that I had decided a long time ago that I would rather be the kind of person who was right about how she behaved than the kind who was right about how she felt. I also told her that the loan document has a schedule, and that I would be enforcing it, and that I have never in my life missed a payment or let anyone else miss one either. She laughed. It was not a happy sound, but it was a real one. It was the first honest thing to pass between us in 3 decades. Walter's chair is still by the window. I have not moved it, and I am not going to. People spend a great deal of energy deciding who counts as family, and they almost always do it out loud, in rooms, in front of witnesses. It is a loud sort of business. The other kind happens quietly on a Tuesday above a hardware store, when a man with a bad transmission writes down a number that costs him something, because he has decided who he trusts with the money. They walked me out of a room to divide up a company. They never once checked whose name was on the first page.